Organization and control of neural function or structure and function of the nervous system really should be a review for you from anatomy and physiology. So we're going to run through this rather quickly, but I do want to make sure that you understand and refresh your memory about how the nervous system is organized and how it works to control the rest of the body. Remember that the nervous system receives stimuli from both the internal and the external environment. It interprets that stimuli and then integrates some selected response from that stimuli. It basically works to provide communication between organs. It integrates body functions, controls many body functions, recognizes sensory stimuli, basically allows the human body to interact organ to organ and to interact with the environment. So not only external but internal environment, recognizing and interpreting different stimuli such as heat, light, sound, pressure, temperature, and etc. The nervous system, remember, is divided into two parts. You have the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which is made up of your cranial and spinal nerves. You have a sensory motor region, which is the midline of the brain. Motor neurons descend down the spinal cord from that area, and sensory neurons come up from the spinal cord in the midline. The autonomic nervous system we've talked about since day 1 of class. Remember, the autonomic nervous system has two sections, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system we talked about specifically when we discussed the stress response, mainly in the alarm phase, because it is during that phase that the sympathetic nervous system reacts very commonly by releasing catecholamines, specifically epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, we haven't talked any about dopamine, but it is another one of the chemicals that is released from the sympathetic nervous system. Those chemicals from the sympathetic system will only attach to adrenergic receptors, cells that have specific adrenergic receptors. The parasympathetic nervous system, the main neurochemical that we have released as a response from parasympathetic activation is acetylcholine. It is only going to attach to cells that have cholinergic receptors on it. Again, adrenergic neurotransmitters are specifically those released from the sympathetic nervous system, main ones being epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. They are only going to attach to cells that have adrenergic receptors. There are 4 different types, alpha 1 and 2 and beta 1 and 2 receptors. Now, I'm not going to ask you this on the test, but just to show you how things relate and how this all goes together. Remember, we said when the sympathetic nervous system is activated and you have the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, and think back to the alarm response in stress, your blood pressure and your heart rate go up. They go up because there is a constriction of blood vessels. The blood vessels constrict because that epinephrine and norepinephrine attached to alpha 1 adrenergic receptors and beta 1 adrenergic receptors, which cause the constriction of blood vessels and speeds up and strengthens the heart contraction. So just to kind of put it into perspective for you and how everything is related. Acetylcholine, again, being the main neurochemical from the parasympathetic reaction, attaches to only cholinergic receptors, 2 different types, nicotinic and muscarinic receptors. And if you think back to what we said the parasympathetic nervous system did when it was activated, it always slows the heart rate, but it increases GI tract motility because it causes vessel dilation. So just again, putting everything together. Your neurons are the functioning cells of the nervous system. Again, review from anatomy. The dendrites, basically, if you think about it, there are three different main parts here. The cell body, which contains the cytoplasm and the nucleus. The cell body is also known as the soma in some books. You have the dendrites, which are those tree-like, finger-like branch extensions of the nerve cell body. They reach out and bring information toward the cell body. And then you have axons, which carry messages or stimuli away from the neuron. Your book also talks about axon terminals, which is where the neurochemicals basically are stored and where they are released from. All neurons have Schwann cells, which are a type of supporting cell, which contain myelin. Myelin is also sometimes referred to as white matter. It's called white matter because it has a lot of lipid in it, a lot of fat, so it looks white when it is wrapped around the axon. And basically that myelin covers the axon. It contains a myelin sheath there and coats the axon, and it is specifically there to help increase the speed of impulse transmission or impulse conduction. Three types of neurons. You have your sensory neurons, which are also referred to as afferent, which transmit impulses to the spinal cord in the brain. And then you have motor neurons, which are also referred to as efferent, which transmit impulses away from the spinal cord and brain back to the muscles and glands. You also have interneurons, which are referred to as connecting neurons. They transmit impulses from the sensory to the motor neurons, kind of like a middleman if you think about it that way. So kind of to put it all together, if you touch something hot, then it's going to be sensory neurons that transmit that impulse to the spinal cord and up to the brain, or the sensation of heat. And then, of course, your brain is going to send a message down the motor neurons. Then motor neurons that transmit the message down the spinal cord, or excuse me, from the brain down the spinal cord to the muscle that causes your hand to lift up off the hot stove. So there is supporting tissue in both the peripheral and the central nervous systems. We've already talked about Schwann cells. Again, they form myelin that wrap around the axon for protection and to increase the speed of conduction of impulses. You also have satellite cells, which separate nervous cells from other tissue. Again, in the peripheral area. In the central nervous tissue or the central nervous system, you have several different cells. Oligodendroglia are also myelin-producing cells. Astroglia regulate the ion content in the intercellular fluid, ion meaning things like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen. Microglia work as phagocytes that clean up when there's been some type of infection or cell death, like after a stroke. And then ependymal cells line the neural tube cavity in the very beginning when the brain and spinal cord are actually forming. Your nerves, we've talked specifically about neurons. You know, the axons are grouped together to form nerves. They really look like the strands of a cable if you had them grouped together, and they are covered by connective tissue, again wrapped and covered by myelin so that impulses can travel through those nerves, and that happens every single second of our lives, very fast, in order for our body to communicate with both the internal and the external environment. Nerve impulses, which we refer to as action potentials, can travel over trillions of routes, routes made up of neurons, again. And if you think about action potentials, we also refer to the electrical impulse in the heart that caused contraction and relaxation as action potential. So that action potential in the heart was stimulated by the movement of electrically charged particles. And basically this is doing the same thing. Nerve impulses are waves of electrical disturbances that travels along the surface of a neuron's membrane. It occurs because of a change in voltage or positives and negatives inside and outside of the cell. So very much works like the heart does. A couple of terms just to re-familiarize yourself with. Remember that a neurotransmitter is a chemical. It's stored in the axon and it's going to be released into the synapse in response to an action potential or an electrical charge. A synapse, remember, is a gap between a neuron and maybe another neuron or a neuron in another cell where impulses travel from one cell to another. You can see here in this picture that I have the portions of the neuron itself, and if you look you can see the axon that's in the middle that is called a normal nerve. If you see that, you have the axon down the center and the myelin covering, what we refer to as a myelin sheath or sheath covering. And in that normal nerve, you see how it is very protected. It is full and coats the axon completely. If you look at the nerve above that, that is actually a nerve that is damaged. And I want to say that this is probably referring to multiple sclerosis. This is exactly what happens in multiple sclerosis because the myelin covering is actually destroyed, and that's what you can see in the nerve at the top. The myelin is damaged, so obviously that's going to affect how fast or how well the impulses travel down that specific nerve. Neurotransmitters, neurochemicals can be made of lots of different substances, amino acids, some are peptides, some are monoamines, and neurons can do many different things. They can attach to receptors and change that particular cell's response to a certain chemical. So they are very important to our body function and can do lots of different things. Just to show you how wonderfully made we are, this whole nervous system begins as a hollow tube, which is amazing to me, and you can see this in this picture. The first segments of the tube at the very top is what is going to become the brain. Right now, as you see in this picture, that's a hollow tube, and this is a forming fetus here. You can see what's going to be the heart, what's going to be the eye, what is eventually going to sprout out as an arm and a hand. Again, the top portion you see is going to be the brain. It's actually separated there for you to show you what's going to be the fore, the mid, and the hind brain. And then the long tube down at the bottom that curls around is going to be the spinal cord. So it's amazing how we are formed in 9 months. This is a good picture too that I added because it shows you how the spinal cord comes down, and you see the vertebral column, and you also see the cord and then the protective coverings there that or the protective layers that are connective tissue that surround not only the brain but the spinal cord to keep it safe. This picture shows just the organization of the spinal cord. There is a dorsal root and a ventral root. The dorsal root is where the sensory nerves or the afferent nerves move into the cord and then eventually up to the brain. And then the ventral root is where the motor nerves or the efferent nerves are going to come down from the brain and the spinal cord and then eventually stimulate a muscle. Again, just a good picture here that shows the spinal nerves coming out of one area of the spinal cord, out of the vertebrae there, and how you can just imagine how easy it is if somebody had a spinal cord injury, how everything below that area is then completely cut off. another picture here just showing the same thing. It's just amazing. The different regions of the brain, again, I'm sure this is reviewed from anatomy, but just to make sure, the forebrain is made up of the cerebrum, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. The midbrain includes cerebral peduncles, aqueduct, and colliculi, and then the hindbrain is your cerebellum, pons, and medulla. The functions of the hindbrain are what we sometimes refer to as the brain stem. Really, the brain stem includes the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. So it is probably one of the most important areas because it houses your reflex centers for heart and respiratory rates, coughing, swallowing, vomiting, things of that nature. So basically, this is like your vital sign center of the brain. Cranial nerves 5 through 12 originate from this area, and of course the cerebellum works heavily with fine motor coordination. We've mentioned over the course of the semester how if someone were to have a bleed or a major hemorrhagic stroke in the brainstem area, it is very difficult to overcome because that is really the main respiratory center. This is a good picture that shows you the areas of the brain. The forebrain includes your cerebrum, the hypothalamus, and the thalamus. The thalamus, of course, is the switchboard or the relay station for impulses coming from the cerebrum and going to the cerebrum, emotions, some recent memory control. The hypothalamus, of course, we've talked over and over again about how much it controls balance and maintains homeostasis in lots of different areas. Hormone balance, temperature, appetite, osmolarity, all of those different things. And then the cerebrum, which is really makes up the largest area of the brain, works with personality, judgment, thought, language, reasoning. Cranial nerves 1 and 2 for smell and sight originate from the forebrain mainly. More on the cerebrum. Again, the largest portion of the brain is divided into a right and a left hemisphere and divided into 4 different lobes. You have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobes, temporal lobes, and occipital lobe. And this picture shows exactly what's going on in each area of the brain. Again, starting with the brainstem, that is your vital sign center. Controlling all of your involuntary actions, breathing, digestion, swallowing, coughing, vomiting, and whatnot. Very, very important. The temporal lobe, a lot with memory, hearing, understanding language, and behavior. The frontal lobe, problem solving, emotional traits, reasoning, and judgment. Speaking and voluntary movement. Parietal lobe, sensation, reading, knowing right from left, body orientation, things of that nature. Occipital lobe is mainly vision, and then cerebellum is balance, fine muscle coordination, and control of voluntary movement as well. Last but not least, just to talk about the different protective layers of the brain and the spinal cord. Inside the skull and the vertebral column, the brain and the spinal cord are loosely suspended and protected by connective tissue layers, and we refer to those connective tissue layers as meninges. Mommy. What, baby? Okay, sorry about that. The meninges are those connective tissue layers that are protecting the brain and the spinal cord. The outermost layer, the outermost protective layer or meninge is the dura mater. The dura mater has 2 layers. The inner layer folds over to form a fold that separates the right and the left hemisphere, as you can see here on the picture. Again, it is the layer that is directly under the skull. It also forms a second fold that holds the cerebrum up off the cerebellum. Now, just under the dura mater, you have what we refer to as a tiny little space. We refer to that as the sub, because it's under, beneath, subdural space. All right? Between the layers of the dura at the base of each fold, venous blood drains out of the brain into a sinus. The sinus also collects cerebral spinal fluid. Now, there are also bridging veins there that carry blood from the brain to that sinus as well. And if you go back to that picture in the previous slide, you can see how those layers form a little cavity there at the very top up under the skull. Just underneath the dura mater, under the subdural space, you have the arachnoid layer. And if you look at your picture, you have the skull, and then you see a brown layer, that would be your dura mater, and then the orangey layer would be the arachnoid meninge. Lies just beneath the dura mater. You have cerebral spinal fluid just underneath the arachnoid layer to cushion the brain. That is in the subarachnoid space. Okay, so it's in the subarachnoid space that your cerebral spinal fluid is really circulating. And in the arachnoid layer, there are little extensions, two small extensions called villi. They look like antennae to me, that poke through the inner layer of the dura mater into that sinus. And you can see that clearly here in the picture. That allows cerebral spinal fluid to drain into that sinus. Okay, so far we have now the skull, which is the ultimate protection. Then you have the dura mater, subdural space, arachnoid layer, subarachnoid space, and then the innermost layer is the pia mater. It lies right on the surface of the brain, and it holds the cerebral arteries in place. So that is the pinkish layer that is actually flipped up there on the right bottom side. So just to recap, the meninges, which are those protective layers of the brain and the spinal cord and the meningeal spaces, you have the dura mater, which is the outermost layer, then the subdural space, then the arachnoid layer, then the subarachnoid space, which is where your cerebral spinal fluid is circulating, also cerebral arteries in that subarachnoid space, and then the innermost layer is the pia mater, which is actually laying up close enough to the arachnoid layer to keep those cerebral arteries in place. Last but not least, your cerebral spinal fluid is a clear, or should be a clear, colorless filtrate of the blood plasma. It has about 99% water. It passes out an opening below the cerebellum and circulates around the brain and the spinal cord, mainly in the subarachnoid space. It passes through the arachnoid villi into the blood in that dural sinus, the dura mater sinus cavity, and is returned to the heart.